Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Art Alvarez with MortgageWorks, where we have the answers and they're on the house. Welcome to this week's Mortgage Minute. We're fast approaching, I guess I'd call it the unofficial start of summer, the Memorial Day holiday weekend. I think official start of summer is around June 21, right? But of course, we all like to look at the Memorial Day holiday weekend as the unofficial start, as I said. So we're certainly getting a little toasty out here in the Palm Springs and greater Coachella Valley area. And so with that, I want to go ahead and get right into our program because we've got a lot to talk about. Some interesting things going on in the financial and bond markets. As you know, what we like to do is give you an interest rate update first by showing you our rate grid on our website. And despite all of the interesting financial news and anxiety about tariffs and the big, beautiful bill that's been going through Congress and now a new concern about deficits and so forth, interest rates are actually hanging in there pretty well. Again, it's getting to be kind of a boring, redundant comment about rates, but they're still right smack dab in the sixes as they have been for really many weeks, if not months. So you can still see there that conforming 30-year fix is right there in the mid sixes, right around 6 and 5/8, slightly elevated. The 3-2-1-2-1 buy downs again up a little bit, but still in the threes and fours as a start rate, 3 3/4 or 4 3/4, depending on which buy down term you choose. 15-year loan still hanging in there just under 6, and then FHA VA right there in the low sixes. So again, given all the issues, all the financial hand wringing and tariff concerns and so forth, rates are sticking pretty stable. And I think that's going to be the case for quite a long time. If you look at the bond market chart, it's kind of interesting. It was pretty low going back to last Friday. We had that kind of uptick early in the week on Monday. What that had to do with was the Moody downgrade, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then we were starting to dip down into Tuesday. Didn't continue into the Wednesday dip that Jeff likes to talk about. It started to get elevated again on Wednesday, and that has continued up until now. Although we did have a nice little improvement earlier today because, as the market closed yesterday, we were approaching 4.6 on the 10-year bond yield, which we hadn't been at that level in quite a long time. But the day finished off a little bit better at the right there, as you can see, about 4.54. So what's interesting about the bond market movements this week is when you look at the economic data point calendar for this week, it's actually pretty light. There was literally no economic data to speak of Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. Now again, there was the Moody's U.S. credit downgrade on Monday. The stock market sold off. The bond markets, the 10-year bond yield did get elevated, but that didn't hold. It did settle down on Tuesday. But overall, what's going on here is bond jitters seem to be back, and which is interesting because remember last month, or actually was a week ago, the latest inflation numbers actually came in pretty good. Both the CPI and the PPI came in lower than expected, and inflation actually had, in fact, been as low as it's been in quite some time. And yet, the bond market's gotten pretty jittery. What's going on? Well, it's not just about inflation anymore. And again, this is a good example of how the focus of the markets and the bond market in general can shift as to different data points or concerns about fiscal or monetary policy. And that, I think, is what's going on this week. Part of what's happening with bond yields this week is there was a treasury auction, an auction of U.S. Treasury bills, and it was met with weak demand. And of course, when demand for a new treasury bond auction is being seen, what that causes is a rise in yields in order to basically get those bonds sold. So that's part of what's going on this week, was a weak treasury auction, a weak auction of treasury bills that did occur midweek this week. And then the other part of what's going on is the fiscal and monetary policy uncertainties. In particular, what's kind of shifting in the narrative is, you may have heard, I guess overnight, Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives anyway, the House side of Congress, did pass the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, part of which, of course, extends the tax cuts from 2017. Well, what's interesting about that is being looked at in the markets, bond market in particular, is not particularly good news. The reason being, by extending the tax cuts, plus, of course, this thing about no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, the thought is, well, that's going to generate more budget deficits. What's interesting about that is it's that classic case that we've seen now for many years where the markets and financial analysts and the rating agencies, they look at the tax policy and the effect on revenue and then government spending, and they just assume that, well, if you reduce taxes, you're taking money away from the government, and because the government's not good at cutting back their spending, that's automatically going to create greater deficits, which are going to be a problem for the bond market, because greater deficits plus the potential for inflation causes the bond yields to generally tick up, not down. But that ignores what, believe it or not, about 40 years ago, in fact, right now is about the 40th anniversary of the Laffer curve. If you remember that was kind of the creation of supply side economics, the theory that if you cut taxes, you can actually generate more revenue to the government because economic productivity will go up significantly. And of course, interestingly, that was a Democrat idea going back to John F. Kennedy in the early 60s. That, and I'll admit, when I went to school and got my economics degree, I came out of school from a school that supply side economics was sort of the mantra where I went to school. And so it's going to be an interesting debate going forward. Will these tax cuts really cause more deficits, or will they in fact spur economic growth that could in fact generate more revenue to the government that would actually reduce the deficits rather than increase them? So we'll have to see how that plays out. But right now in the short run, the markets are not adopting the supply side economic theory idea and are thinking that if this bill does pass with all these tax cuts, that the deficits are going to be worse, and that's not going to be friendly to the bond market. The only other two data points worth mentioning this week are home sales, existing home sales and new home sales. Well, existing home sales came out today. They were forecast to be up from last month. And again, this is for April. In March, remember, existing home sales was barely over 4 million, 4.02 million. The forecast for April was going to be 4.13 million. Well, it came out today lower. It came out at 4.0 million. So existing home sales disappointed, not as high as expected. And I'm seeing evidence in our market that that's not a surprising number. And remember, that's still a depressed number. A normal market in terms of existing home sales should be more like 6 million, not 4 million. And in fact, 4 million in April of 2025 is the lowest it's been since April of 2009. So again, that points to continued challenges, continued weakness in the home purchasing market, particularly existing home sales. And then with new home sales, which were at about 725,000 in March, they're forecast to be down in April at 695,000. That's going to come out tomorrow. Now, that's not going to move the markets much in terms of the bond yields and mortgage rates, but I think that forecast for new home sales to drop to 695, I think that's going to prove to be a pretty accurate forecast. And again, more indications that the housing market continue to have its challenges. But in that respect, which is what me and Jeff are going to talk about now, I think that's actually good news, these weak numbers, if you're a prospective home buyer considering getting into the market finally to buy a home, not waiting any longer. I think these numbers are actually going to be a good thing for you in terms of getting out there and negotiating a purchase. So with that, we'll go ahead and bring Jeff in so we can talk about. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Art. How are you?
Doing all right. How are you?
Good. You know, when you start talking about that supply side economics, it reminds me of a book I'm listening to with Ray Dalio, and he's talking about things like that. And it's just counterintuitive, but it actually is proven to have worked, where it actually doesn't cause inflation to go up. It actually causes inflation to go down because we're actually out maybe saving more and then actually investing more in the economy, which is really nice, which also puts more money into the federal bank account, if you will. So
Yep.
it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, exactly. And we've had a couple of examples of that, again, going back to JFK in the early 60s. And then, of course, in the 80s, which is when I came out of school and got my econ degree. That was, of course, the Ronald Reagan era from 80 to 88. And, of course, he was a big proponent of the supply side economic theory, which is why Reagan pursued those tax cuts. And the economy did respond very well.
Yeah, I think it's going to be good. Well, today we have a kind of, I'd say, kind of a fun topic because, as you say, it's there's some things out there that help support this. So today is a spring and summer buying season, and how can we prepare? And we're looking for tips from Art for successful buying season. And I'd love to put some things out there like, traditionally this time of year really is, if you think of things as season, maybe in the winter it's snowing, but in the summer and the spring, it's like, hey, this is when things are growing. And with over 4 decades in the industry, isn't that a time where we see a pretty significant uptick in this activity?
Yeah, it's true that historically the spring season has generally been looked at as the high season in terms of activity. And part of that has to do with the fact that, of course, school's ending, we're going into the summer, and a lot of times families, if they've got kids, are going to be if they're looking to buy because maybe they're renters, they've got kids, and they need to get into a home because they need more room, or maybe they're in a home now, but it's not large enough to meet their needs because now they have kids, and or maybe they've got little kids who are going into school, and no longer just toddlers. Then they want to get that home purchase done before the fall when school starts again. So that's part of what drives this phenomenon of home sales generally do seem to peak more going into the spring and early summer.
Well, I think about I'm going to say the makeup of the Coachella Valley, and at first glance people say, oh, well, it's an older community. And I remember when I first came to the Coachella Valley back in 1997, or actually it was 1996, and what I was told by, at that time, my employer was in the golf industry. They said, well, the average age of the person in the desert, and I took it with a grain of salt, said his average is 70. And nowadays, the numbers are more in the mid 40s, which I think that supportive evidence of that's a lot of young families.
Right.
Those are kids like you're talking about. They're waiting for the kids if they're going to move to another area. So it feels to me like, hey, you know what? The flowers are blooming, the birds are singing. It's time to get out there and buy a home. But we want to make sure we do it right and make sure we're prepared for that. One of the questions I have is it necessary or advised to get it pre-approved before one begins to start looking at a home?
Well, you know what? Good question. In fact, I would argue that it's no longer advised, it's virtually mandatory. And the reason I say that is because, a couple things. If you've made a decision to buy a home, of course, one of the first things you're going to decide to do, most likely, is you're going to need a real estate agent. Okay. And when you go out there and look for a real estate agent to represent you, to go out and begin the process of searching for and submitting an offer on a home, the rules have changed going back to August of last year with the National Association of Realtors settlement. Remember, the DOJ and the NAR got into a big lawsuit having to do with real estate commissions and so forth. The outcome of that was, as a buyer, if you retain an agent to help you go out and look for homes, that agent must now have you execute a contract. It's called a buyer's broker's agreement. And in this contract, it's going to stipulate what that agent's going to do for you, what services are going to offer for you as a buyer's agent representing you as the buyer. And it's going to include what the buyer agent is going to ask to be paid as a commission. So understand that's going to be your first step. You're going to have to find an agent, and that agent's going to present you that agreement to be signed and executed. And you're going to be committing to paying that agent a commission. Now, the real world outcome so far has been you don't actually, in most cases, end up paying that commission. You end up negotiating to have the seller pay it. on your behalf. But that's another issue. So the point of that is, when you sign that agreement, most any good agent is going to then ask you to get pre-approved with a lender, because they don't want you to go out. They don't want to go out with you and start showing you homes if they don't already know for sure that you're qualified for the price level that you're going to be looking at.
Well, it's one of those things. I mean, it makes perfect sense, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but you've got those people that are tire kickers. They're just kind of looking for that new car, if you will, after the dealership closes. They're just kind of looking at it without any pressure. But as you say, with this shift, with the way we have to now say, yes, I'm hiring you, and I promise to pay you your commission. You got to be a little more careful. So I'm just curious, what kind of documents then do the average people have to get ready? Let's say when they come to you and say, we're thinking about buying a home, and we want to get pre-approved. So it's like, what documents do I need to get organized to help be ready for this?
Well, one other comment before I answer that question regarding getting pre-approved. It is pretty important when you go out and seek a lender or a mortgage originator to get pre-approved, that you're working with someone, frankly, who knows what they're doing. Unfortunately, it is still the case where a buyer will get pre-approved by a lender, a mortgage originator, only to find out later, if they submit an offer, get it approved, and they go into escrow, and then during the escrow period, they end up finding out they're not going to get approved, or they're not formally approved by the lender's underwriting staff. I'm dealing with that situation right now, where I've got a purchase loan in process that's subject to the borrower completing the sale of an existing home. And they had accepted an offer. My borrower accepted an offer from a buyer, opened escrow, and 2 weeks into escrow, my borrower, who I'm handling the purchase for, called me to say, my buyer's canceling because he can't get approved for his loan, even though he was pre-qualified when they got that buyer's offer and accepted it. So I just want to stress the importance of where you go to get pre-approved or get pre-qualified. It is very important. You want to make sure you're dealing with someone who has adequate knowledge, experience, and understanding of mortgage guidelines, so that when you get this pre-qualification or pre-approval document, that it's worth the paper it's printed on. So go ahead.
I was just going to say a little follow-up question to that. It's like it's almost like, well, which one comes first, the chicken or the egg? If I need to get pre-approved for a loan before I go out, but I haven't looked at any homes, how does that all work? I mean, don't you as a lender need to have a property identified before we can actually go through that process, or am I all wet on that? Is it changed?
No, you don't have to have a specific property identified. Of course, we want to generally know what kind of property they're interested in purchasing. Is it going to be a single-family detached home? Is it going to be a condo? Could it be a manufactured home? So we do want to know generally what kind of property that buyer is interested in purchasing, because it can have some impact on the loan terms. In particular, that's going to have to do with a single-family detached versus a condo, and how much of a down payment you're going to make. Because a lot of folks don't realize, if you're going to look at a condo, a lot of folks think that the magic down payment number is 20%. That's going to help you make you more qualified, better qualified, and that you're going to get a better rate. Well, a lot of folks don't realize that for condos, that's not quite true. To get a better rate, or I would say the best rate, you really need to put 25% down on a condo, not 20. The federal mortgage agencies charge what they call a price adjustment factor on condos of 0.75% of the loan amount, 0.75 of a point.
Wow.
On a condo, because a condo is considered a more risky property type. And that 0.75 of a point fee, which is generally absorbed into the rate, will mean that if you were thinking, I'm going to put 20% down on a condo, you're actually going to end up getting a rate that's going to be 1/8% higher than if you put 25% down. Now, it's just important to understand that that's the case. In many cases, you don't have the 25%, so it is what it is. You've got to accept the fact you're going to have a higher rate, only because you don't have that 25% down payment number to achieve that better rate that's available. So we just need to know generally what kind of property it is, but otherwise we can go ahead and complete the pre-qualification and even go further to a pre-approval, just knowing the property type without having a specific address.
Well, it seems like that's such a better way to do it, Art, because now it's almost like saying, hey, we now know our budget, we know what we can afford, so we're only looking at homes that are priced in that range, right? We're not actually looking at a home that's $100,000 more than really we can afford, and we fall in love with it, and then we're disappointed. Is that right?
Exactly, and that's really the whole purpose of the pre-approval or pre-qualification. That again, starting with the agent who says, before I start showing you houses, you need to talk to a lender. I want to make sure you're on solid ground for that price level that you tell me that you want. I don't want to show you $600,000 homes when we end up talking to a lender who says, no, you got to look at $400,000 homes. So, because otherwise that's a big time waster for everybody. So
Yeah.
that's important to establish. And then getting to your question about documentation, there's some very basic document parameters that people should understand. And I would argue that if you're a renter and you've been thinking about wanting to buy a home for a long time, and you're kind of feeling like you're getting to the point you want to do it, there's some basic things in terms of document retention, I would call it, that you should keep in mind. Your pay stubs. Any lender is going to want to see your pay stubs for the last 30 days. So I encounter folks quite often actually who, they're a W-2 wage earner, they're on a salary or hourly, they get a pay stub every 2 weeks, and they just throw them away. They don't keep them. Don't do that. Keep your pay stubs at least for the most recent 30 days, and keep that on a rolling basis. In other words, keep your 30 days of pay stubs, and then you're getting more, you can start throwing them away then, but keep the most recent 30 days. Keep your most recent 2 years W-2s. Keep your most recent 2 years tax returns, both personal or company, corporate, business returns, if applicable. Bank statements. Keep your most recent 2 months bank statements. And be sure to have the ability to pull a PDF copy of your bank statement. And again, a lot of folks don't keep their bank statements. They may get them in the mail, look at them, throw them away. Or a lot of folks say, well, I do online banking. I don't get bank statements anymore. So I can't give them to you. Well, that's not really true. Most any major bank, you can go online, because if you say you have online banking, you're not getting your statements in the mail. Well, that implies you can go onto your account online at the bank's website, and any major bank will give you the opportunity to pull a PDF copy of your bank statements going back 12 months or longer. So, but yet I remarkably come across a lot of folks who don't seem to know how to do that, even though they're all about being online. So I find that kind of interesting. So, and then beyond that, if you're going to purchase a home, and maybe you own a home currently, then realize that there's some things you need to have handy related to the property-related expenses on your existing home, like be able to have access to the homeowner's insurance declaration page. Hang on to your monthly mortgage payment statement. And then also, if you're paying HOA dues, hang on to at least your most recent monthly HOA billing statement, because if you're going to be purchasing a home while continuing to own another, that maybe we call it a departing residence, you're going to move out of that and buy another, but keep the existing home, you're going to have to provide that documentation on the expenses related to your existing home that you're keeping. And again, if you say, well, I make my mortgage payment online, I don't get a monthly statement, well, you got to figure out how to grab a copy online with that lender, with your insurance. Most folks don't even know what a deck page is on their insurance policy, and they don't know where to find it in their records. I always say, contact your agent, ask them to send you a copy. And then again, with the HOA dues, a lot of times, I don't get a monthly statement, I pay it online. Again, go to your property management company, pull a copy online from them, and then you'll be good to go.
Well, it doesn't seem like an overwhelming amount of paperwork to get in line to make sure hey, we go out with confidence and get pre-approved. It seems like it's pretty much on target with that. after let's say I select the property, and now it's like, hey, we're really in the game. We've got a property, we're pre-approved. Is the amount of paperwork we need after that, is it a lot, or is it just supporting changing documents? Let's say it takes me 60 days to get things going. Do I have to then say, okay, I just need to update like things like my pay stubs and things of that nature?
Exactly right. I mean, if you have those items readily available at the start when you're pre-qualified, pre-approved, then depending on the length of time you're searching for that home, those items start to expire. So particularly if you're actively in the home searching process, you've already provided that basic documentation I just described. Understand that the longer it takes for you to go out and look at homes every weekend and finally get to the point of submitting an offer, well, that 30 days of pay stubs, the most recent of that 30 days may now be 30 days old. So then you're going to have to provide another 30 days more recent because the first 30 days that you gave at the time of the pre-qual have now expired. So you want to kind of maintain those up to date during your search. And then, once you find that property, you submit it, you get an offer accepted, you're opening escrow, additional documentation at that time can occur, but that has more to do with when the lender underwrites the file and is looking at your documentation. Some of that documentation may generate additional questions or requests from the underwriter where you go, gee, I already gave you that. Why do you need more? And a key area where that happens is bank statements. And we try to kind of get a hold of that in advance. But when we get your 2 months bank statements, for example, a mortgage lender is going to look at those bank statements and they're going to look for large deposits. And the general rule is any large deposit that is more than 50% of your qualifying income, like from your job, then the underwriter, when they approve that loan, they're going to say, please source and explain or source and document where did this large deposit come from? The purpose of that is to make sure that that's not new money that you borrowed that creates a loan obligation, a payment obligation that you haven't disclosed in your application. And that can get people a little grumpy when if we say we get those bank statements and we miss a large deposit and we're in underwriting and the underwriter conditions for that, yeah, I've got to go back to that borrower and say, hey, look, we got to explain and document where did this money come from.
That makes perfect sense, especially when we're talking about, buying a home. It's one of the largest purchases we'll make in our lifetime. And the last thing, I guess, you want to say if you're the lender is like, well, you're not borrowing the down payment. You have that already. And that would certainly show up all of a sudden if it's in your bank account.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit how you've kind of alluded the last few weeks how inventories are starting to change. And, they seem to be in a better position this year than last year. What does that mean for the buyer?
It means buyer leverage. I don't know if you've noticed, and looking at all the financial news, and of course, on the one hand, we talk all the time on this show, beware the headlines. On the other hand, I'm seeing some headlines more recently in the last several weeks, more and more about how the market is shifting. Homes that are listed for sale are on the MLS longer. Days on market is getting more extended. Price reductions we're starting to see more frequently. Inventory of listings is growing. And that is as a prospective home buyer who's been waiting and waiting and waiting for home prices to fall, dramatically, which I'll say again, that's not going to happen. But there's been enough of a shift in terms of those parameters I just described that a prospective home buyer, I think, is in a much better position now to negotiate some concessions from the seller. I would say this is the best time for that we've seen in the last several years. And I've talked to a lot of real estate agents who, on the one hand, they're kind of moaning and groaning about the fact that they're holding open houses and they're not seeing enough buyers come through. That's one issue that they're complaining about. The other thing they're complaining about is their sellers are not coming to grips with reality. A lot of these agents are talking about they're listing properties for sellers who are not embracing the fact that the market is shifting. and that they either need to realize that maybe they're priced their home too high, or if they insist on leaving that price where it is, they're going to have to be willing to consider concessions requested by the buyer. So I think now more than ever, a prospective buyer has a very good opportunity to go out, make an offer, submit an offer where you're going to get those concessions. And of course, as you know, we've talked about on this show many times, I'm a big proponent of don't just willy nilly, first crack, just offer 50 grand below the list price. Be more strategic about that. If you're going to get a loan and you're already grumpy about where rates are at, and maybe you're struggling for the down payment, you can address those concerns directly, but do so by getting the seller's money to do that. So don't offer 50 grand below the list price. Offer the list price, or maybe much closer to the list price, not 50 grand lower, but 10 grand lower, and then ask for a seller credit that might be 15, 20, 25,000, and then we can show that buyer how that can be used to permanently buy down their rate for a 30-year term or a 20-year term or 15-year term, whatever term they're looking for, or a temporary buy down, either a 3-2-1 or a 2-1, where they're getting a first-year rate 3% below our current rates in the mid-sixes. And in a lot of cases, you can get enough of those dollars, that seller credit dollars, that not only will it cover the permanent or temporary buy down, you'll have money left over to cover maybe a good portion, if not all, your closing costs. So, and again, if you're a buyer who's been waiting for the prices to fall and the rates to fall, you can address both of those by negotiating an offer where you request that seller credit in dollars, in order to get you better terms on the loan. Again, either a permanent rate buy down or a temporary for 2 to 3 years. And again, if you do the temporary, that gives you that window for when rates finally do fall, you can refinance that note rate and have a long-term loan at a much better rate than you started out at. Jeff, you there? I think we have some technical difficulties. Looks like Jeff's screen has frozen. So we'll see if he comes back on here shortly. Well, folks, I think we've lost Jeff. He may have lost his connection on this show. Let me go ahead and cover one other subject that I think Jeff wanted me to talk about. And one of the things he wanted me to mention is what advice would I give buyers, particularly here in my market in the Coachella Valley, to help you with the approach of pursuing a home purchase and try to eliminate anxiety and stress that can come with the home buying process. Because it can be, as you may have heard if you haven't bought a home before, or if you have bought a home before, this is true. It can be a rather anxious and stressful process. The first thing I would do is, of course, make a commitment to want to go ahead and purchase a home. So you start with making that commitment to buy. And if you're unsure about that, if you're a renter and you're kind of mulling over a buying opportunity, you're not completely sure if it's the right time or if you're even well qualified, check with a lender like us. I mean, I do this all the time. You can contact me and I can just have a consultation with you. Talk to you in general terms about what you're thinking, what your goals are, and I can help you, first of all, establish if you're even in a position to buy, and then give you more advice about how to go about it in the most stressful way. And one of the things, of course, you'd want to do, as we talked about earlier on the show, is get your documents organized. And if you're contemplating a purchase, you're not quite ready to pursue it yet, but you're very, very close. Take the advice I said early in the show and start gathering your documents so you have them ready, so that otherwise you're not scrambling to get them if you go out and make an offer, get it accepted, and then you've got to hurry up and find them. And in fact, I would say, to really help with the anxiety and stress of a home purchase, go a step further than the pre-qualification or pre-approval process. We can actually gather all your documentation, submit your application for a particular price level and loan amount and a property type without having identified a property address at all. In the business, we call it TBD underwriting, to be determined underwriting. So, a big help in terms of removing or eliminating stress and anxiety in the home purchase is do this legwork in advance. Gather your documentation, submit an application to someone like us. We'll then register your application with a lender, submit your file for formal lender underwriting with your documentation, and get that loan approved, basically subject only to getting an appraisal and escrow and title documents. And that's an advantage for you. Another advantage for you in this environment of a market where I think there's more buyer leverage, if you've got a to be determined approval from a lender, a written approval that we can present that we can give to you and that you can present with your offer, that puts you in much better shape when you're competing with other offers because of the fact you've already been approved. It's all subject to just the underwriting, the appraisal and getting escrow and title items. So one of the things that can do is allow you to maybe offer less than a 30-day escrow. So that is a very good way to lower the stress and anxiety of the home buying purpose. And one of the things about that, why that's so important, is realtors have a tendency to want to compress the contingency periods in real estate transactions. Here in California, as you may know, the standard real estate purchase agreement form, the contract, has standard contingency periods for different things. Appraisal, 17 days. Loan approval, 17 days. Inspection approval, 10 days to 17 days and so forth. Well, think of this. Because realtors have a tendency to compress those contingency periods, and I'm not sure why. In a lot of cases, I think it's just they just want to hurry up and get the deal closed, maybe so they can get paid. But in reality, that does happen quite often. Well, if you've already got a TBD approval in place, well, then if they say, well, we'll accept your offer, but we want you to remove your loan contingency, not in 17 days, but in 12 days, you're going to be in a great position to do that because you've already done all the legwork. You gathered all your documents. We submitted those documents to the lender. It was formally reviewed, underwritten, and approved. So you've already got that work done. It's just getting the appraisal. Having escrow and title give us the documents that they have readily available, you're ready to close. So that can go a long way to eliminate the stress and anxiety, because otherwise, if you get an offer accepted and you've agreed to shorter contingency periods for things like your loan approval and appraisal, you're going to be into a much tougher and much more stressful situation because you're rushing to get that contingency, meet that contingency deadline because you didn't do all that legwork in advance and already have your loan approved subject only to the property. So that would be, I think, very good approach for you to take to keep that stress level much lower. And I think also going to allow you to be more competitive when submitting offers on a property where maybe there are other offers being received by that seller. So keep that in mind when you're looking to buy that home.
Well, Art, I think those are excellent tips. And before we wrap up today, would you mind sharing anything else, again, with your 4 decades plus of experience, that you could say, hey, here's some, not insider information, but really kind of, these are common things that you're not aware of as a home buyer that you can do in advance to make that process better? Any kind of insider information like that?
Well, I don't know if it's insider information. Of course, the other thing I would say certainly is be sure that if you're ready, you're at that point where you're ready to, make the plunge and get into the process to buy a home. Consult with somebody like us, and for sure, don't be careful in terms of incurring any new debt. I've got to tell you how many times I've encountered somebody who says, hey, I want to get pre-qualified to buy a home. And I sit down with them, and part of that process is we end up ultimately pulling their credit report. And here we are in May of 2025, and I find out, oh, they just bought a car in March, and it's got a $950 a month payment. And I say, well, if we had talked in February before you bought that home, I could be able to help you. Now you've created quite an obstacle because it kind of became the cart before the horse. Yeah, you had that eye on that fancy car, but you probably should have put that off if you were thinking you were about ready to purchase that home and start the process of purchasing that home. Put off that car purchase first,
Mm.
get that house nailed down, and then go out and get that car. Because the way car loans are qualified, you're probably going to have much less trouble still getting that car loan versus the other way around. If you get that car loan first and it's a big payment, and then you're trying to buy the home, and that we can't get around that because that goes into your debt ratio. And that, in fact, that's a good point to bring up. Debt ratios can be very important. And again, debt ratio is a very simple concept, really. We're going to determine what your qualifying income is, and then we're going to tally up any recurring monthly consumer debt, monthly payment on credit cards, installment loans, car loans, and student loans. We're going to add all those up, figure out what that amount is per month. And then once we identify what the projected housing expense is going to be for the home you want, principal and interest, taxes, insurance, HOA dues if applicable, we're going to add that to your consumer debt payments. And then we're going to divide that into your qualifying monthly income. And that's going to arrive at your debt ratio. And that debt ratio for most programs, you don't want to exceed 50% or you're going to have trouble qualifying.
Good point. Good point. Well, Art, as always, great information. And folks, tis the season. I'm not talking about Christmas. I'm talking about home buying. Now is the time to get out there. And but before you do, get a hold of Art. I'm going to put his information on the screen. You can get hold of Art at 760-969-5023. That's his office. You also see his cell phone on there, 714-612-9035. And check out his website for the loan information. It's updated. How often do you update that, Art? I mean, when it's significant.
Just about every day, because believe it or not, rates can move a little bit up and down every single day. So yeah, we do try to check it every day.
I really appreciate it, Art. As always, you're a wealth of knowledge, and again, you take the stress out of buying a home. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening to this week's Mortgage Minute. My name is Art Alvarez at MortgageWorks, where we have the answers and they're on the house. Have a good weekend. It is the Memorial Day weekend, so you're going to be maybe doing a beach outing, backyard barbecue. So definitely enjoy that with your friends and family. But remember, the real purpose of Memorial Day, it's to honor our troops, in particular our fallen troops who give us the opportunity to enjoy this weekend, as I hope most of you do. So again, please enjoy your weekend, but keep our troops, our fallen troops in general, in particular, in mind and in our hearts, and while you're enjoying that weekend. So we'll see you again next week on the next edition of the Mortgage Minute. Thank you so long and take care. Bye-bye.